All right, let's dive right into this explainer. We're going to look at how a global health crisis secretly, well, kind of, rewired our brains to care a whole lot more about the environment. Because, while most of us were just trying to figure out how to bake sourdough, our travel psychology was actually undergoing a massive transformation. Today, we're looking at some incredibly fresh, eye-opening data from a study of international tourists over in Greater La Plata, Argentina. And as you'll see, it turns out that the 2020 lockdowns didn't just change where we travel, they fundamentally changed how we think about the footprint we leave behind.
Here's our roadmap for today's explainer. First, the post-pandemic tourist. Second, health risk psychology. Third, the economic factor. Fourth, gender and sustainability. And finally, number 5, sustainable tourism strategies.
Okay, section 1, the post-pandemic tourist. Let's actually look at who the modern traveler has become in the wake of those unprecedented 2020 lockdowns.
Think back to that very first trip you took after the lockdowns were lifted. Were you suddenly a bit more aware of your surroundings? Maybe more conscious of your personal safety? Or even the environmental impact of your choices? Well, you definitely aren't alone. Researchers noticed that this heightened sense of vulnerability was creating a completely new type of tourist, one who suddenly cared a whole lot more about the natural world.
And that brings us to this fascinating psychological concept called the norm activation model, or NAM. Researchers adapted this to include something they call pro-environmental health. Simply put, it's a psychological process where recognizing a physical or emotional risk, say, a global virus, actually triggers this deep, almost instinctual moral obligation to act responsibly toward the environment. It's wild, but fearing for our own health somehow activated a moral duty to protect our planet. Moving right along to section 2, health risk psychology. Because, let's be real, a theory is just a theory until we have the numbers to back it up. And the data actually revealed a very powerful link. Instead of getting totally bogged down in complex math, the crucial takeaway here is this undeniable human truth. A heightened sense of emotional vulnerability directly fueled pro-environmental sacrifice. Basically, when tourists felt a moral duty to the environment, which was activated by their pandemic fears, they were overwhelmingly ready to make real financial sacrifices to protect it. We're talking paying extra for carbon offsets, upgrading to certified green transport, or just choosing a more expensive eco-lodge. The numbers here are just striking. The study found that tourists who reported a high emotional risk perception, meaning they really felt that social stress and emotional toll from the pandemic, well, they registered 23% higher scores in their moral environmental obligation compared to those who didn't. Think about that. Vulnerability quite literally made people more morally committed to the earth. So to understand exactly who is driving this post-pandemic shift, researchers surveyed 151 international tourists in the region. And when we look at the demographic breakdown, the generational split is incredibly telling about where the future of travel is actually headed. Generation Y, better known to us as millennials, absolutely dominated the dataset at 42.4%. Turns out they aren't just shifting market trends, they're the loudest voice dictating the future of eco-conscious travel. They're the ones feeling this moral obligation most acutely, which means they are the primary demographic the tourism industry needs to be listening to right now. But here's a great question. Who do these tourists think should actually fix the environment? Neutrally looking at where they place the responsibility, we see a huge emphasis on personal, civic duty. Over 30% point to civic commitment, meaning it's up to us as individuals, while only 18% point to businesses, and just 15% rely on the state or government intervention. People are really taking this responsibility onto their own shoulders. All right, on to section 3, the economic factor. Let's dive into the plot twist of our story, because having good intentions is one thing, but paying for them is a whole different ballgame. Here is the harsh reality. Good environmental intentions are heavily dependent on personal financial stability. The data showed that of those whose daily routines and economics remained stable during the pandemic, 45% were willing to pay a premium for ecotourism. But for those whose routines were severely restricted, which implies financial or deep lifestyle disruption, that number drops to just 28%. You really have to be economically stable to comfortably prioritize those eco-premiums. Section 4, Gender and Sustainability. Let's see how these economic and psychological factors play out across gender, because the data takes another really fascinating turn here. The data reveals a very distinct divide. When asked about their willingness to make real-world sacrifices for the environment, women consistently demonstrated a higher willingness to act compared to men.
They weren't just showing more concern on paper, they were indicating a much higher readiness to actually alter their behavior and absorb costs for the sake of sustainability. Looking at the specific breakdown on a 7-point scale, women scored significantly higher across the board in actionable daily sacrifices. For example, reducing energy and water at home scored 6.4 for women versus 5.6 for men. Sacrificing preferred brands for eco-friendly ones, 6.15 for women, 5.47 for men. So it's pretty clear that women are leading the charge when it comes to adopting the granular daily habits of sustainable living. And finally, Section 5, Sustainable Tourism Strategies. Now that we've got a solid grip on the psychology, demographics, and economics of the post-pandemic tourist, let's look at the blueprint for the future. Looking at the path forward, the research maps out 4 distinct strategy quadrants. It contrasts these isolated, single-actor efforts against really powerful public-private alliances. The bottom line from the research is crystal clear. If destinations want to actually capitalize on this new traveler's psychology, disjointed solo efforts just won't cut it anymore. The strategies require a totally united front. To truly capture the psychological shift, the tourism industry has to build real, tangible infrastructure. We're talking certified eco-lodges and clean transport networks that make sustainable choices absolutely effortless for the traveler. Plus, awareness campaigns need to clearly highlight the positive impacts of these choices. And none of that happens without deep, collaborative alliances between local governments, private businesses, and the communities themselves. So, to wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a provocative thought to test your own limits. We've seen today that health crises can absolutely rewire our brains to care more. But we also saw that caring is ultimately tested by our wallets. So, when the time comes to finally book your next getaway, what is the exact price tag you put on your moral obligation to the planet?